Please welcome one of California's premier land use attorneys, Jennifer Hernandez, partner with Holland & Knight and a member of the Bay Area Council Executive Committee.
People are leaving, but this is going to be the nerdiest of all panels. It will be incredible. Led by yours truly. I'm the Tesla with the license plate Sequin Nerd. You can, actually true. I am so excited to tell you all about, I think, one of the best books I've read in many, many years. I inhaled it. It's called Abundance. It has been hard to be a Berkeley Democrat and practice CEQA and have any self-respect because we use process to block progress. It is a baby boomer overhang. And I was privileged to be at the first Abundance convening as one of the oldest people in the room. And there were all these people saying, so since when we voted process over progress? Since when we can't have what your generation has? Since when we're blocking innovation with lawyers? Since when? That's ridiculous. And it is ridiculous. And Derek Thompson has written a terrific book with Ezra Klein that kind of calls the question, left on left, why are we not allowing people to prosper? Why are we not building in the physical world? Why have we took laws that were around when the Beatles were still together, weaponized them, know we've done it, and not have the gumption to change it? I'm really thrilled to introduce Derek and Kristina, of course, the magnificent chair of the Bay Area Council, and leave you, though, with two questions. Abundance for whom? Ezra and Derek are both brilliant urbanists and environmentalists, and they support small apartments and riding the bus and hoping for solar power. And that doesn't work for other people or for the physical world. So abundance for whom? And then secondly, 23 years on the board of the California League of Conservation Voters. That's me. Environmentalism used to be also equity. Environmentalism in this day and age has turned into scarcity, planned degrowth. And how do you square the abundance part of being a Democrat with the environmentalist part of being a Democrat? So I'm thrilled. I think this is going to be a great panel. Welcome to the Nerd Zone.
Congratulations on the book. I think I read this morning that it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for 9 weeks now. That's an incredible accomplishment. And it certainly struck a chord with us here in California, I think in part because of the examples that we all have lived, actually, and experienced really in real time. And I'm just curious to start, what inspired you to tackle this issue, to write this book, to really dig in?
First off, thank you for having me. I think some books are written out of love and some books are written out of deep frustration. And this was a book written out of a sense of both love and anger at what progressivism and America had become. This origin story for me was in early 2021. I was standing outside of a public library in Washington, D.C., waiting for a COVID test. And there was a line snaking around the block for COVID tests that were being rationed. And as I was just freezing in Washington, D.C., I was thinking to myself, it's been a year of pandemic, and we're still rationing COVID tests. And before that, we were rationing the vaccines. And before that, we were rationing the PPE. And before that, we were rationing the masks. It just feels like this entire experience of the pandemic has been one scarcity after another. And as I got really angry and thinking more broadly, it felt like the entire century of the American economy had been one story of scarcity after another, that we can't build enough houses, we can't build enough clean energy. And these are not scarcities that are technologically determined. We know how to build houses, right? The technology of the elevator is approximately 170 years old. We know how to build solar panels. That technology was also invented in the 1950s alongside nuclear power. First nuclear power plant was also built in the 1950s. We barely build any of those anymore, 70 years later. And in thinking about this century of manufactured scarcity, I thought what we really need is an abundance agenda to put up against it. And I had been talking to Ezra Klein for a while about these ideas of scarcity versus abundance, and this beautiful turn of phrase he has of supply-side, of demand-side progressivism, which is to say Democrats being fixated on taxing and spending in order to improve human welfare, very important, but that in the last 50 years we haven't been as good on the Democratic side at supply-side progressivism, at building stuff in the physical world. And so we sort of merged those two tributaries of scarcity and abundance and demand-side progressivism and supply-side progressivism, and out came, I guess, the baby of this book, Abundance.
And if you haven't read it, you should pick it up. And he has a Sharpie in his pocket. He'll sign it for you also. Would you call Abundance an operations manual, a guide to cultural transformation, a leadership manifesto, or a governing doctrine?
I never want to tell readers how they should read a book. What is that theory of authorial intent? Once you've written something, once you've painted a picture, once you've made a video game, it's not up to you to determine what the audience gets out of it. So some people, if they get a leadership manifesto, that certainly wasn't the intent, but good on you. Sure, fine, read it as a leadership manifesto. We really were just trying to write a book full of things that are true. We weren't even trying to tell hard truths about the world. We were just trying to point out things that were true. There were answers to big questions that we had, like, why can't America build enough damn houses? Why, if progressives and liberals are so behind the cause of climate change, is it so difficult to add clean energy in blue cities and blue states? Why, if Democrats are the party that believes in government, are they too often the party that is home to government that doesn't actually work on behalf of the working class? And then on science and technology, which are the final chapters of the book, what is the secret to scientific invention, which is the bellwether of progress, and how do we build what we invent here? Because too often in American history, modern American history, we invent things, whether it's computer chips or nuclear power, and then some other country somewhere else around the world becomes the vanguard, the leader of that technology. We really just wanted to answer the question, why are these things true about the world? And in answering those questions and just trying to tell truths, I think we ended up telling some hard truths about liberalism, about progressivism, about the Democratic Party, and about California. Because many of these stories in the book, many of, I think, the most painful stories to report out and research are about the fact that California, which is Ezra's home state and a place where he has lived for many, many years, has become just a poster child for the inability of places run by liberals to meet liberal goals. I mean, I think it's really important to say that Ezra has this lovely line that Democrats should be able to gesture to California and say, vote for Democrats and they'll make America like California. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where it's too easy for Republicans to gesture at California and say, vote for Democrats and look what they'll do to America. Right? You want to make the places where you have the most power be advertisements for your movement and not marketing brochures for the opposition. And in too many parts of this country, I think, not just places in California, but across the country, we've made it very, very easy for Republicans to say, look what happens when Democrats have power. And what we want, me and Ezra, and I think most Democrats and most progressives, we want the places where Democrats have power to serve as advertisements for the movement, and in particular, to show that where Democrats have power, we can actually build things in the physical world like houses and clean energy.
Well, for what it's worth, the way I experienced the book, I asked you the question about what you would call it. The way I experienced it was as a counter manifesto to this book, which the Stanford Environmental Law Society produced back in 1971, and basically was a roadmap for what we got ourselves into. We followed it almost, to a complete T. Look, in California and the Bay Area, business leaders like those in the room have been sounding the alarm about permitting delays, regulatory compliance. I mean, many of the issues that you talk about in the book, of course, we've lived and experienced California's high-speed rail for all of these years. What do you think took so long for the ideas in your book to resonate? I mean, why is your book a New York Times bestseller for 9 weeks now, when so many leaders have been sounding the alarm? I mean, dating back to 1979 in this book, where an MIT urban studies professor said, here's what's going to happen if you keep going with the things that you've put in place.
The truth is, I think it's very hard to say why a cultural product meets its moment. Sometimes it's just some weird kismet. The last book that I wrote was a book called Hitmakers, which was sort of ironically, given the nature of this question, a book about how the psychology of hits, why people like what they like, and why some cultural products, music and movies and television shows take off. And I worked on that book really, really hard in 2015 and early 2016. And it came out in early 2017, and Donald Trump was president. And no one wanted to talk about like the secret of earworms and why certain music and TV shows and movies took off. They just wanted to talk about how the hell did this happen and what's going to happen in the next 4 years. And in the same way, I think a book like this, we tried very hard to make it accurate and good and readable and true, but sometimes a cultural product just meets its moment. And I think this moment is strange for a couple reasons. First, I think the Democrats suffered a loss in 2024 that wasn't just a mathematical or arithmetic loss, it was an existential loss. I think there was this sense that the bottom had finally fallen out of what the party stood for. And if you look at the party nationally, it's not clear there's anyone who's truly in the vanguard, who's at the front of the parade, right? When you ask people who's most likely to be the 2028 presidential nominee, it's just scattershot. It's all over the place. And so there was, I think, this demand for a new message of what the Democratic Party could stand for that wasn't just the same old, same old. And we wrote a book that's all about building in the physical world. And I don't think Democrats have been known, unfortunately, as being the party that is obsessed with progress and unembarrassed of prosperity. A party that's willing to say, we should want businesses to grow and people to get rich, and also for the law to be followed, and also for the bottom to be lifted so that more Americans come out of poverty. We can want all these things at the same time. We don't have to pick and choose. And so I do think that there was interest in a message like that. But I also think that what happened is Donald Trump won an election that was all about unaffordability. If you asked Americans who switched from the Democratic column to the Republican column in 2024, overwhelmingly, the reason they gave is that life was unaffordable. And if you ask young people, especially young men, who are the group that shifted to the Republican Party at historic numbers, they too overwhelmingly said, we are becoming Republicans because it is too damn unaffordable to live in this country. And Donald Trump had an amazing opportunity in that moment in January and February this year. He could have said, we're going to have a blue ribbon commission to make sure that building a house is as cheap as possible. We're going to make sure it's as easy as possible to build things in this country, like clean energy. And instead, what does he do? He slaps a tariff of 50% on Canadian lumber and a tariff of 50% on Mexican drywall, raising the cost of two of the most important inputs for housing, and raises the price also of all manufacturing inputs for the U.S. economy, and also in this most recent bill essentially wipes out all the tax credits for clean energy. So in many ways, I see that the Trump agenda, which could have been a kind of right abundance agenda, has been an agenda of almost proud scarcity. It's like every time he sees something that America doesn't have enough of, he tries to take away something that we have, right? He says America doesn't have enough housing, and so what we need is fewer immigrants. Or America doesn't have enough manufacturing, so what we need is less trade, right? It's this less is less philosophy. And I think that juxtaposed to that, this message of more is more abundance has really resonated not only with Democrats and liberals who want to grow the Democratic Party, but also for unhoused Republicans, former Romney Republicans who are like, who stands for my ideas of like, I'm a capitalist, but I also care a little bit about inequality and I want poverty to go away. Who stands for those ideas? Well, I'd like to see the tent of the Democratic Party grow just enough to incorporate those folks as well.
So let's dig in a little bit to some of the details of the problem. I think in his recent podcast, Ezra Klein was talking about or suggesting that one of the reasons we're in this predicament is because government is under-resourced. And our experience here in the Bay Area, of course, is that we've got more than 100 cities, each have their own city councils, planning commissions, architectural review boards, historical commissions. We have dozens of separate transportation agencies, all with varying degrees of responsibility for our public transport system here in the region. And then we've got numerous other regional bodies like the Bay Conservation and Development Commission or the California Coastal Commission that to us government seems to be a big part of the problem. So how do you reconcile those 2 points of views, government being under-resourced and then us seemingly here in the Bay Area having so much government, it's slowed things to a halt?
I want to hold on that word, resource, right? In your question, you defined resource as people. And that's definitely that's one example of a resource. There's this rule I know from software that if a software development project is running late and you add more people to that project, it makes the software project run later. And you can certainly imagine that rule being applied to government. That if you have a problem and your solution to that problem is to grow the bureaucracy that exists around the solution to that problem, what you will do is not accelerate the solution, but just create more conversation about the problem, right? And government, I think, sometimes is often very good, as many bureaucracies are, private sector bureaucracies too, very good at adding people once you have a bureaucracy full of people. Sometimes the road most traveled is you have a problem, throw people at it. But to go back to this concept of resource, this word resource, there's other ways to think about giving government the resources that it needs to accomplish its goals. Right? The story of California's high-speed rail project, which is the story of nothing happening to the tune of $33 billion, is a story of under-resourced government, in a way. Now, you can count the resources by saying, here are all the spending items. Here are all the law firms that were employed in various CEQA challenges and various permitting processes and various eminent domain hearings. You can count the resources that way. But if you define resource most broadly as, can the state have the power to accomplish what it sets out to do and, in fact, inscribes its power in legislation? California was horrifically under-resourced and remains, in many cases, horrifically under-resourced to do what it wants to do. Because the second that anyone ventures out into the physical world, they are immediately enmeshed in the Lilliputian rules of everything we've been talking about, the permitting and the CEQA and eminent domain and all sorts of environmental assessments and reviews. It's very, very hard to build in the physical world because of the changes that have happened in the last 50 years. And I think that one thing we're calling for in this book is a reevaluation of that last half century of rule accumulation, right? Let's not think that the best way to help government achieve its goals is to say we have a set of problems, let's hire more people to approach the problems. Let's think, what are the rules that are really getting in our way, that no longer serve the causes they claim to serve, right? Like CEQA in so many ways and NEPA in so many ways are now environmental review and environmental assessment policies that are used to slow down the construction of clean energy across the country, right? So we are using the tools invented by the environmental movement of the 1960s to destroy the environmental movement of the 2020s. That's not, in a way, I actually don't want to blame the 1960s hippies who passed those laws. They were responding to the problems of their time. The 1940s and 1950s were absolutely frigging disgusting, and we needed to clean it up. The air was gross and the water was gross, and we needed laws to fix it. But what happens in politics is that sometimes the medicine of one generation becomes the disease of the next generation. Right? That's not the fault of the 1960s. It's our fault for not having a spirit of institutional renewal to say, they solved the problems of their age, why don't we solve the problems of ours? So I would like government to outfit itself with resources by tearing away the laws that were written for problems that no longer exist and rewriting the laws for problems that do.
Hear, hear. So to get into solutions, we have seen some targeted reforms here in the Bay Area and across California, things like streamlining accessory dwelling unit approvals, some CEQA streamlining, and there's more pending in the state legislature currently. But that broader change you're talking about has been elusive, and we haven't been able to get there, notwithstanding that we've been having the conversation here for a number of years. Do you have any local or international examples that could offer us some hope about breaking down these entrenched systems so that we can deliver more housing, deliver clean energy, deliver the infrastructure that we need to here in the Bay Area?
Look, there are absolutely examples of cities and countries that have changed their laws and seen housing permitting and housing construction boom in the aftermath. Spokane is an example, New Zealand's an example. But I think what's happening in the state Senate is really important and really instructive of just how difficult this is. You know, environmentalism 1.0 in the 1950s, 1960s was a long movement. It was a movement that fought and fought and fought and finally had a batch of legislation signed in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And I think this generation of environmentalism that sees the need to, that recognizes that degrowth is not an option and the only path forward is building energy superabundance that doesn't choke the planet in carbon emissions. That path requires growth. It requires the construction of a lot of clean energy, solar and wind and geothermal and nuclear and beyond. And right now, we do not have the political will to build it. We just don't, right? I think that the Wiener-Wicks bill is going to get killed in the Senate if it hasn't been killed already. I loved so many of the parts of it, CEQA for infill, accelerated permitting for clean energy projects. A lot of it has been killed or will be killed. Because the folks who are in the California Senate just do not support this legislation. Maybe it's because they personally don't support it. Maybe it's because they perceive that their donors, their voters, don't support it. But the battle of persuasion has not been won, right? We need to keep working to persuade people that the status quo is not an option. The status quo is a world that leads to California being a place that Republicans outside of the state can mock and build support by holding it up as an example of what happens when liberals have power. And also, it's a place that too many people are leaving. Not only the working class, but also a lot of tech founders have been leaving California in partly because of political frustration and partly because it's just too damn expensive. And so I think at some point the dam is going to break. But it's not going to break because a book was on the bestseller list for 9 weeks, right? I'm really, really proud of that accomplishment. But that is not enough, right? And I'm really, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that this is a war of persuasion that can be won. But persuasion is politics, and politics is the slow boring of hard boards. This is going to take a while, and we need a lot of people to be with us.
Well, that means we need a lot of people in this room, too, to be with us as these bills work their way through the state Senate as well. And I know, and watch your Bay Area Council emails for ways that you can be involved. On that point, I heard you reference both Spokane and New Zealand, where I think we should take a Bay Area Council delegation to really learn from them. But are there specific examples from those communities, what they did in Spokane or what they've done in New Zealand? That
I don't know enough to be able to graft what happened there onto the San Francisco or onto the California experience. I know that in New Zealand in particular, they liberalized housing construction, they accelerated permitting, housing construction boomed, and price inflation moderated, or housing inflation moderated. But I don't know enough about the nitty-gritty to be able to say, and this is the advice I would give if I were in Scott Wiener's office and say, all right, well, there was a senator in Auckland, and he did this, and I wish I had that story, and maybe I'll work on it for the next time I come back to California.
Do you have any opinion? In California, the California Coastal Commission, of course, gets a tremendous amount of attention and was one of these agencies that was stood up back in the 1970s and then enhanced over time as well. But there are literally thousands of agencies across the state. Do you have any suggestions about where to start? Or do we have to start with this more macro level conversation and, to your point, really make it part of the overall political conversation? Or do we start one by one targeting some of these agencies that are the real problem?
Well, look, some of these agencies, some of these committees, some of them are law and some of them are groups. And the distinction that I'm trying to draw is that some of them have to be changed exclusively by law, and some of them you simply need to ignore, right? And I think that ignoring is a hard thing for progressives to do. It's really hard. Progressives are very good at, I've been trying to work in the language of this. We're very good at drawing specific circles of care and then paying laser sharp attention to that circle that we draw. So one example that I sometimes give is this sort of classic example of an environmentalist objection to a new housing construction that has to be built on an area within the city limits that has trees. And what they'll say is, you can't cut down these trees. And sometimes there'll even be riders of the law that says, for every, say, if you cut down 5 trees to build urban housing, you have to plant these 5 trees somewhere else. I say, I understand that. I don't want to just cut down trees. I think that's fine. You see the trees, you recognize those trees have to be cut down in order to build the apartment. I get that. But if you don't build, right, the 40-unit apartment building on those 5 trees, then 40 single-family houses will be built in the suburbs that require the demolition of 500 trees. And now what you've done as an environmentalist is use your ability to care about this circle to kill net 495 trees. And I feel this like the same thing happens sometimes when we had the mayors that were sitting here on the stage. The same thing happens sometimes, I think, in city council meetings, where politicians who think of themselves as being good liberals and good progressives are very good at paying attention to the voices that they can hear, the voices right in front of them, and they fail to pay attention to the global picture. And I remember I was having this conversation with the mayor of Durham, where he was telling me that they had recently voted no on a new housing development in the Chapel Hill, Durham area. And he said, it's very difficult because when there's a new housing development that comes up, there'll be 50 people that come to that city council meeting, and 45 of them will say, I don't want this new development. I'm against this new development. It's going to be bad for my farm. It's going to be bad for this, bad for that. And there'll be 5 people who raise a lonely hand and say, I'm worried about the cost of housing in Durham, and I'd like there to be more apartments. And he said, it's very, very difficult to know that I represent Durham, and these are my citizens, and they're telling me, 9 to 1 in this room, no, no, no. I said, I acknowledge that that's really hard, but you're not the mayor of that room. You're the mayor of Durham. And what's more, you are elected by the city of Durham to represent Durham. And what you're doing when you listen to the 45 people in that room is subordinating your democratic power to 45 rich, older homeowners who just happened to know there was a city council meeting at 7:45 on a Tuesday. That's not actually democracy. It feels like democracy because it's local and it's participatory and it's real people getting up to a microphone and saying no. That has the smackings of democracy, I'll grant you that. But it's not democracy itself. Democracy is the people. And for every one lonely vote of the hand going up to say, I think I'd like extra housing in this city, there's 10,000 people who would hold up that hand if they had the time and knowledge that that meeting was happening. And so I do think that a part of this is about changing law. And changing law has to be about turnout or persuasion. There's no way around it. But a part of this is about demanding a certain kind of courage from our political leaders to know how to listen. Because there's a way to listen that seems progressive, and there's a way to listen to actually be what I consider a pro-progress progressive. And in a weird way, it sometimes means not listening to the people that are screaming the loudest in your ear.
You're here again. One of the things that Jennifer Hernandez brought up in her opening remarks was abundance for whom? I think that was the question that she asked. And I think it was getting at this broader concept that the principles and some of the ideas seem focused on urban environments in particular. And I'm curious about, exurban, suburban, rural environment, rural communities, how these principles apply, whether it's the same thing or whether there needs to be a different approach, depending on what type of community you're a part of.
A question I sometimes get from folks who just like the suburbs is, are you and Ezra just trying to force everybody to live in Manhattan? And the answer is, it's a funny question, but it's also a sad question because I'm worried that I'm failing to communicate my urban progressivism in a clear way. Of course I don't want to turn America into one big apartment cube. That would be bad. I want people to be able to live where they want to live. But I also want to slow down on that principle for a second. I want people to be able to live where they want to live. The reason San Francisco is so frigging expensive is because, in part, so many people want to live here. And the fact that it's so expensive is downstream of the fact that they can't. And the reason Manhattan and Brooklyn and so many of these places are so expensive is because people want to live there. And if we made it easier for the most productive cities in America that are the most housing constrained to increase their housing supply, then prices in the suburbs would go down. It would be easier for people to buy the house they want in the suburbs because there would be less people who wanted to live in a city but were priced out to fan out to the suburbs where they didn't want to live and were forced into a situation where they now have to compete in terms of bidding up this housing price against you, the person who only wants to live in the suburb. So I don't want to pretend as if the politics of this book are some kind of complete list of solutions for what most ails rural America. Right? There are issues that rural America faces with economic deprivation and with addiction that we don't dive into very deeply in this book. I mean, this is a 220-page book. You know, I sometimes joke, whatever Jefferson or Franklin said, whatever, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one. This is the opposite. Ezra and I did not have time to write a long book, so we wrote a short one. We were both way too busy to write longer than this. It's a short book. It doesn't solve every problem in America. It tries to solve a finite number of problems. But I want people to see, even if, like you asked, their interests are more suburban or rural, how solving some urban problems also help people who are living in the suburbs.
I think that some who've read your book also get this sort of anti-business sentiment from it. What has the reaction from business leaders across the country been to the book?
I would say I'm surprised by the question because by far the most common criticism of this book from the left is that Ezra and I are part of a corporate conspiracy. So it is, one of my first answers to your question was, it's not the responsibility of the author to tell the reader what he or she should get out of the book. And nowhere is that principle more perfectly illustrated in the fact that some people might read this book and think it's anti-business, and some people might read this book and think that Ezra and I are part of a corporatist conspiracy. I'll tell you what I think about business. I think America has a lot of businesses. I think businesses build houses. I think businesses build energy. I think businesses create drugs and technology that make our lives better. Sometimes they make technology that doesn't make our lives better. But sometimes they definitely make technology that makes our lives better. So if what I'm interested in as an individual, and I'm just talking about me, not Ezra, not anybody else, if what I am interested, me, Derek, is a future of housing abundance and energy abundance and science abundance and tech abundance, I have no idea what the path to that future looks like if I'm against business.
I mean, to that end, do you have an opinion about how the power of the marketplace, really plays a role in implementing the abundance agenda, or specific things that the business community can do to support the abundance agenda?
I don't know how much the abundance agenda, as I conceive of it, is bottlenecked by business. I think that there are absolutely parts of this economy where monopoly power holds back what I would call abundance, where market concentration holds back what I would call abundance. But when I look at housing and I look at energy, I am more persuaded that the problems have to do with financing and labor and regulation than with market concentration. Now, it's clearly the case in energy specifically, I would say. Lobbying by, oil and natural gas companies has clearly not been beneficial for solar and wind companies. But I don't know that I've met a lot of folks who are solar and wind CEOs or geothermal CEOs who say, my number one bottleneck is the fact that business competition in dirty energy is making it harder for me to get financing for this project right now. They tend to be focused, as I see it, on more nitty gritty. I need labor, I need financing, and I need rules. I need federal rules and state rules that allow me to build and allow permitting to accelerate so that I can put stuff in the ground. So, are there things that the business community can do? Play fairly, don't break the law. I mean, of course, I would say that. But I am focused. I feel like I know more. I'm willing to be educated on this question if there's good answers to it that other people in the audience can come up to me and tell me. I know more about the ways in which government gets in the way than I have sort of broad solutions for here's like a 5-point agenda that any business can operate in and suddenly become part of abundance.
We talked a little bit about Doge in some earlier conversations today. And I mean, do you view there as being parallels between Doge, or at least, Doge as it was conceived in this, let's root out waste and efficiency and fraud potentially in these processes?
Yeah. So I have a line toward the end of the book where I say, I would love government to act as a bottleneck detective. There are bottlenecks to housing, and there's bottlenecks to clean energy. There's bottlenecks to medical discovery and bottlenecks to technological development and implementation. And I would love government to essentially do what, credit where it's due, what Operation Warp Speed did with vaccine development. To say there's all these things that get in the way of vaccine development. The clinical trials are really expensive. And then there's market uncertainty if you go to market and someone's come in with a product that you're trying to develop already. And there's also uncertainty about, how are we going to transfer the actual vaccines themselves if they need to be carried at really, really frigid temperatures. And then Operation Warp Speed came in and they said, okay, well, we're going to have push funding to give people money for their clinical trials. We're going to create a prize that says even if you're a pharma company that is like 7th to market with your vaccine, we'll still pay you billions of dollars. That incentivizes you and all of your financiers to come in and try your hardest to develop this drug. And then also we'll work with Corning and glass manufacturers around the country to make sure that your vaccine can be transported to the CVS where someone gets it in their arm. I love this idea of government essentially trying to solve, setting goals, and then looking at the full sort of obstacle course of that process of getting from here to that goal, and then removing the bottlenecks. Doge is kind of like, what if you wanted to be a government reformer, but you were not interested in learning anything at all about how government worked? In fact, what if you were studiously against the idea that you should learn anything about how government worked? There's some aspects of Doge that are just I honestly can't believe you couldn't just ChatGPT that. It's a bunch of 22-year-olds. I know they use ChatGPT. They should use it more for their job. So, for example, FDA. One of the things that biotech companies and pharma companies know is the FDA can sometimes be very slow to approve phase 3 clinical trials or approve drugs that have gone through phase 3. So what they did is they fired half of the folks at FDA. What happens if you're bottlenecked to the number of people who can go through phase 3 clinical trial data? You fire half of them, it's just going to take longer to approve the drug. The folks at Doge say that they're pro-nuclear. They laid off half the office of the Loan Programs Office at the Department of Energy, which is the most important institution at extending loan guarantees of billions of dollars to folks that are trying to build nuclear energy. Literally, if you just asked ChatGPT, what's the most important part of the federal government for financing nuclear power projects? O3 wouldn't even have to think for 3 seconds. It would just be LPO. And one of the first things they did is fire half the LPO office. So Doge is a really interesting example of what if you had government as a bottleneck detective, but you did no detective work and you just started arresting people? I would love government to be an actual department of government efficiency that was government's important. Government's important, and so I'm going to take the time to understand the body that I am sawing into so that I take out the right organ and put in the right stuff. Doge did the opposite, and I think that's bad.
Just one more question to close, because I'm seeing 8 seconds left here, so it'll be an easy question. And I told you about it before. The term abundance pilled has really gained some traction, not just on social media, but also in serious publications like The Economist. How do you feel about the term abundance pilled becoming part of our collective lexicon?
It is an honor to have your project named after a pill.
We're passing out the abundance pills after this at the
Yeah,
reception.
right. No, yeah, this is not a corporate conspiracy. It is, however, a big pharma conspiracy because we've just been manufacturing abundance pills. No, it's honestly it's a huge honor. I don't know who said this first, Bannon, some other conservative, but obviously he was right. Politics is very much downstream of culture, and culture is downstream of language. And if you want to change the world, you need ideas that can penetrate to the level of language. And so the fact that folks are talking about being abundance pilled, the fact that this word has, people feel comfortable sort of incorporating it into their vocabulary, it makes me feel fantastic. So I would encourage more. I'm not a pill pusher, except in the narrow realm of linguistics. And here I am very much a pill pusher. I would encourage everyone to be abundance pilled if they'd like to be.
Well, it's been an honor having you here, Derek Thompson. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you all.